Thank you so much for being here. It means the world to us. My name is Candace Yoder. I'm Executive Director of Matthew Silverman Memorial Foundation. And tonight we are talking to Kate, who I'll let introduce herself. But this is a really wonderful time for us to tap into our inner experience. And your vulnerability is what is modeling that.
Thank you, Candace. So some of you may have noticed that there was a book that just came out. And there are some beautifully placed gold boxes in the dining area. And while they may look like they are part of the design features of the environment, they are actually meant for all of you to take home, to bring into your world, and hopefully to spread the message of what we're here to talk about tonight. My name is Dr. Kate Truitt. I am a clinical psychologist and applied neuroscientist. I am an author, which is still something I'm leaning into embracing, even though it's my second book. And really, I am a purpose-driven human who has been through, as my sweet, darling husband would say, more things than the average bear. And my goal is to bring information to the world, to highlight that the brain is a weird, funky thing, as we know. And there are so many times in our lives where our brains take over, where they can lead us into some very deep, dark places, and to the mission and the vision of the Matthew Silverman Foundation, that sometimes we don't have a way out. And as Candace and I will be talking about, I know my version of that journey. And I was lucky enough to find a way out. And our deepest hope for the conversation today is to spark new conversations and collaborative opportunities to say, when we're in these human moments, it's okay. We're not alone. It hurts, and it's scary. And what if we could also know that it was safe to reach out to one another? Because nobody escapes this world without pain. And we're all in this together.
Beautifully said. Should we sit down and get started?
We shall. So thank you all for being here.
So tonight I'd like to start at the beginning. You wrote this beautiful book that's very vulnerable, and your personal story. What inspired you to do so?
So back in 2019, we had a patient come to our offices who hadn't interacted with any of my team members in 5 years. And he'd had a psychotic break. And he came into the offices with an intention to murder me. And by the grace of God, probably for the first time in, over a year, I wasn't in the office on that specific day at that time. Naz and I were actually on our way to Mexico on a booze cruise to celebrate a friend's 65th birthday. Caribbean cruises for the win. And in that experience, as my team is navigating this incredible journey, and the police officers and the detectives are telling me I'm not allowed to go back to my office. We had helicopters overhead, SWAT team on site. I had a moment of really deep reckoning in my mind and my body where I realized something that I'd known many times and felt in my soul and my beingness, that the world is out of control. And that I also, once again, was tumbled back into a world of trauma. And I had acute stress disorder. And I felt like I had done so much work, and I know we'll talk more about my life journeying through my childhood years and living with PTSD for 5 years. I felt like, oh, finally, I'd had it. I got it. And then when that happened, I was right back in the thick of trauma, and I realized, wait a minute. Life is going to always happen, and we will all always have hard things. And it's important to tell the story through the lens of being a human with human experiences, but also really looking at what's happening in the brain in those moments. And that was where I finally put my pen to the paper and said, what if I can take my story and give it a job? Because there may not be a tomorrow. There may not be a week from now. But right here, right now, I can be supported. I can be purpose-filled, and I may be able to help somebody else through my own story. And here we are.
Here we are. And I admire your bravery. I don't think it's easy. And although many people come to me because of the work we do and they know they're safe with me, they generally tell me that there's not many people they're willing to talk to. Mm-hmm. And so I think by you doing this, it's going to have just a tremendous impact on the community at large, because no matter the work you do, life is life. Yeah. So thank you for that. You mentioned your childhood, and so I hope it's not too soon, but I do want to dive in because
Candace is very straightforward. She warned me. And my parents are here, so we're in this.
You said in your book, which is beautiful, read most of it, not all of it, but most of it, almost there, that you've had depression since the age of 10.
Yeah.
And, I work with youth suicide. Mm-hmm. So that portion intrigues me. And I'm so sorry you went through that, but can you tell everybody here what that was like and how it's shaped you into who you are today?
I think it's so important to acknowledge that our community, our world, our society does not have a lot of discourse around emotions. Now, there are a lot of social emotional learning programs out there that are trying to do very, very good work. And at the same time, many of us, if not most of us, do not have a breadth of vocabulary around all of these different experiences of what it means to be a human. And so many parents in this world are taxed, overwhelmed. They don't have the resources. And the world is unfolding around us all of the time. And so as a child, we're learning from our caregivers how to show up in the world. And if our caregivers haven't been given the opportunity to be invited into their own emotional world, and I love you, Mom and Dad, and I also know the unique journey of your own experiences, in fact, partially because, Dad, I've met your parents, and I love them, don't get me wrong, but also looking at the generational experience of what it means to be a psychologically minded human. This is a very new thing in this world, and that's a huge part of why we're here tonight. How do we bring this information to the world? For me, I was deeply suicidal as a little kid. I didn't know what it meant. I just knew I didn't want to wake up the next day. I didn't know who I was in the world. And I used to dream that I would actually visualize myself. I would put myself into sleep, imagining being kidnapped so I could be taken away so I could return better. And eventually I realized that there was a part of me that was just like, maybe I just don't need to show up anymore. And I know I'm not alone in that. And it was really, really hard because I also deeply loved my parents and I saw how hard they were working to do everything they could. And the juxtaposition of that. And what's it like for any of us when we're so lost, when we don't know how to be seen because we don't know how to ask for what we need in order to be seen, because we don't have the vocabulary for it? How many of us don't have that vocabulary or had to learn it later in our lives because we're not taught how to have those conversations? And often in our world, it's not safe. It's not okay to say, I'm depressed. I'm scared. Or, God forbid, sometimes I'd rather just not wake up. But what if that was okay? Because it's human. Sometimes life is really hard. Man.
Your bravery. It's, you touched on so many things that I think are important, even with these social emotional programs coming out. Then parents aren't used to, or they don't have the vocabulary, but the general public overall is so uncomfortable with discomfort and don't take those emotions on. And I love what you're doing to change it. I really, really do.
Right back at you.
Thanks. You have an extensive, beautiful career. And there are a lot of misconceptions out there about therapy and ways to get help. And I'm curious if you will share with us what those misconceptions are and how we can help change them.
If this was one of my trainings, this would be the point where I would turn to all of the therapists and say, so how many of you had the opportunity to go to therapy when you were a child or an adolescent? And maybe 2% of the room would put their hand up. Because even conversations around mental health are so novel and new, which again is why we're here tonight. And I can tell you, growing up in the Midwest, therapy, not a thing. Not a thing. And from so many of the conversations I've had with my friends and my colleagues and my other family members, same thing, not a thing. Or if you are in therapy, it's because you're crazy, you're broken, you're wrong. And I ended up in therapy finally because I almost died from a heart condition. And I talk about this in the book, where I had such a severe cardiac arrhythmia that my doctors were like, you gotta go into the hospital. And I called my parents and I'm just like, and they're like, shit, we better pay attention. Something's happening. And here's what's so interesting about treatment and PTSD and trauma. Now I'll just ask, how many people here have had something traumatic happen? No. Right. Yeah, every single one of us. And not too long ago, trauma patients were only found in the cardiac wards. PTSD wasn't even a diagnosis. That's real. And yet no human walks through this life without trauma. And in the field of mental health, trauma still has an interesting stigmatization around it. I was having a conversation with one of my dear friends this morning, and we were talking about how one of her supervisors is now just, after about 20 years in the field, realizing that she should lean into the idea of trauma treatment. This is a therapist. Our field has a long way to go. And I'll be the first to admit that. And in large part, a huge part of my mission is to say, what if we were to recognize in full force that therapy is a privilege, mental health and wellness is a human right. And maybe we can't change some of the systems around mental health because they're highly politicized. And instead, what if we can break down the barriers to access and bring everything into the community in a different trauma-informed way? And I think that is going to be a critical part of the way forward, because stigma, financial access, because of our own barriers of shame, to be able to put our hands up and say, I need help in those hard moments, those things can actually lead to people dying, and they do. And suicide is the #1 killer of adolescents and teens today. We are not doing enough. And there's so many variables that we can lean into to try to change. But also, what if we started on the ground floor and said, you have the ability to heal yourself? And took the stigma out of it and said, humans have pain and that's okay. And let's start a different conversation. That's what I wish for my young self. When I look at my young 10, 12-year-old self, she needed a lot of love.
So as you were recounting your story, which pieces were most difficult to retell to yourself, let alone the public?
There were 2 parts that were extremely tender. The story opens up with me giving the eulogy at my late fiance's funeral. He died a week before our wedding. He was a victim of the opioid epidemic. We'd been together for 10 years, and his family had become my family. And after his passing, nobody acknowledged that he died because he had an addiction. And so identifying how to share that story in a tender, mindful, careful way that honored his story. And he was always very clear that my story, because he walked with me through some very hard, painful things, he saved my life. And he was always very clear, when life happens, there is a purpose we give it, and storytelling is the purpose, and we are narrative creatures. So I knew I had his, whatever you call it, divine spiritual promise and okay permission to tell the story, but how do I protect his family and not share experiences that were not mine to share? And that was the exact same experience that I held for my own family. And as I unfolded the stories of my childhood, of my family's story, how to hold those with kindness and tenderness and love and support, and also a continual checking in of what is safe to share. Because how do we honor not only that we are in the journey, but also when we write a tale that is going to be published, the ripple effects can be very large. And not too long ago, about 2-3 weeks ago, and I told you this story, I went out to my parents and I gave them the final copy of the book. And they've read several iterations, and even my dad will be the first to say that my shitty first draft was a really shitty first draft. And my dad read it, about half of it in one sitting, and then read the other half very quickly in a second sitting. And one of the things he said was, I'm so glad I know how it turns out, because this is so hard to read. And the other thing that he said, which meant the world to me, was, and you have been so kind with our story. And to me, that is the most valuable feedback I could have gotten, because we are all doing our best. I believe, even if we are, and this is the weird counterintuitive thing, even if we are intentionally hurting somebody, it's because our brain is saying, I have to hurt this person in order to be safe. Now, just hold that for a minute. Our brains are weird. But I know everybody in my life has always done their best to do their best. The warmest of hearts, the clearest of intentions. And when we don't know what we don't know, then we get to be in what happens next and show up within that to the best of our ability. It's not always easy.
So that's the difficult part of your story to recount. There had to have been some empowering points as well. So why don't you tell us about those?
Of the writing of it or the actual book?
Both.
I remember a moment where I was pacing in my backyard trying to figure out how to tell a story. Chapter 3 specifically of the book. And I was on the phone with my mom for about 3 hours unwinding. How'd you best tell this part of the story? And then we got off the phone because this was about a deeply personal part of the journey where I was exploring childhood patterns, how our brain learns to keep us alive and to be in relationship. And also exploring how my late fiance and I had a trauma bond and had created a codependent relationship that basically ensured that if anything happened to either one of us, we would be decimated because we had lost ourselves and become an entity, John and Kate, Kate and John. And when he died, that really was what showed up in my own world. I was decimated by it. And I was also exploring in those moments how to tell these tales of our developmental experiences, which of course linked back into some pretty complicated stuff throughout my childhood. And so my mom gave me a lot of really important feedback and support, and basically carte blanche to tell a lot of the stories. And then she said, there's a book I can write when they're dead. So thank you for that. Dad, I don't know if you know that. But you can help. Okay, cool. We'll co-write it. And then I reached out to Rebecca, who's here tonight. And I said, Rebecca, I really need your help in crafting this in a kind and mindful way. And she helped me sit with so many of these tender moments and to find a way forward. And while that sounds so fundamentally simple in terms of writing a story, what it really was for me as a little girl who never felt like it was safe to be seen, to have feelings, to exist, who literally instead decided in her deepest heart of hearts that it would be better to just stop breathing, to reach out and say, help me tell the story of that little girl. Not just to reach out to my mother and to have the opportunity to have that conversation with my own mother, which is a gift, but to also to reach out to my community, to nearest and dearest people, and to be invited into an exploration of learning how to share the story of my little girl in a different way and honor her when my own brain was saying, maybe her story doesn't matter. And to be repeatedly told, actually, little Katie, matters. You can't leave her out. Let's take care of her now. It's her turn. And that underlying process has been transformative all the way to this moment. And even sitting here with you and why we're doing this event tonight.
Did it make it difficult being a clinician? Because clearly back in the day, it was taboo to disclose. And in some fields, in the field I work in, it's encouraged as long as it's helpful to the client, not to you. But here you are exposing everything. Has that affected you professionally or?
So I gave all my patients a heads up that there was going to be a thing happening. And I think one of the things that's so interesting in our field is the most successful part of therapy is what? Rapport. We know the therapeutic relationship is the deal breaker. That is literally the most profound part of any therapeutic relationship. Not the modality, not the theory, not the training. It's who are you as a human. And yet we have been proselytized from the powers that be to not be human in therapy. It's very weird. And as somebody else has an MBA in healthcare administration, has studied HMOs extensively, I'm kind of like, well, are we just trying to create roadblocks to success by saying therapists don't get to be human in the relationship? Now, to your point, it is part of our therapeutic job to assess what part of our story may or may not be of support of the therapeutic process and to not make therapy about us. And I can share, I had one client that I did self-disclose to very early on, a little bit of my story because she was a widow and I was a widow. And she said, nobody would ever experience anything like this. And I was just like, I've had this experience. And she's like, yeah, but no. Like, oh, okay, got it. Yeah, no. She really needs me about her. And that was me actually overstepping my therapeutic boundary. On the other hand, the one thing that I've heard time and time again is that when therapists are also human, the work is more real. The work is more valuable. It's deeper. And the amount of ourselves that we bring into the work, that's for us to hold. But also when we can break down those barriers and say that there's no ivory tower. We're just people being people who also have trained in things. And I've always thought it was very fascinating that doctors can go play golf with their patients. They can go have dinner and hang out and have a good time. And yet the therapist cannot have any sort of relationship with their client. And I understand versions of why that's very, very important. But also it's like, aren't therapists just people too? And what if we can start to break down those barriers? And there's a huge movement happening in that space. And I'm very honored to be a part of that movement. Because there's no ivory tower here when it comes to humanity.
I've heard people call that movement very radical, and hopefully they can experience some radical acceptance of the movement. Ron and I, my brother-in-law, Ron, he referred me to my trauma therapist, and it was the woman who helped him get through the devastating loss of his son to suicide. And she self-disclosed, and that helped me to be able to open up the pain of what I had been through in my life. So I don't know if you've experienced it yourself, but I'm very grateful that my brother-in-law referred her to me because it was life-changing, absolutely life-changing.
So when she shared with you, what shifted?
My ability to see her as human and understand that her experiences, she was a Holocaust survivor, that her experiences were similar yet different, but that humanness allowed my pain to be more understood.
Yeah.
No, it made a huge difference. So I'm forever grateful. She passed away a couple of years ago, but wonderful woman. So you do have this extensive training, and although this book is about your stories, I know the goal is for you to help people. So with everything you know about trauma, there are people out there that think they can't recover, that 2 years later, they're still in so much pain, they can't see the light. What can you share with people that feel this way?
And I know my version very well. There's two critical pieces that I would share. One is what we know now about our ability to actually change the way our mind is functioning. The actual neurobiology of our system is so different for where we've been in the past. And that's a huge part of my drive. There's something called the translational lag. That means that what we know in the scientific world, I call it the ivory tower, is 14 years ahead. That's generous. I would say more realistically, 17 to 18 years ahead of what's actually being practiced on the ground by our mental health providers, by our communities, by our systems. That is devastating. And that is also, oddly enough, an opportunity and hope. Because we know now that we can partner with the brain and the body, and that we can actually create profound changes in our own mind-body system through guided support, like a therapist, and also through doing our own healing work. And that when we have the knowledge to understand and partner with our own brain, that in of itself is transformative. And that is actually the primary reason why I wrote this book. Because this was a very hard book. It took me 5 years to write this book. I wrote another book in the interim and published it in 8 months. But at the end of the day, when we understand that we can partner with our brains and that our brain is ultimately looking out for our survival, and that all the things that really hurt us, dissociation, panic, suicidal considerations, depression, very deep fatigue, that all of those things are a neurobiological process based on so many fundamental tenets of our childhood and our developmental journey. And that we can change the way our mind and body is functioning around those experiences because of something called neuroplasticity. There is foundationally light at the end of the tunnel. And on the second point, we're all in this together. When we can reach out in our darkest moment and say, I need help. But that requires one thing, to know that when we reach out, we will be received. And that is why we have to change the conversation. We have to know that we can be received. Otherwise, we will not reach out.
Teen Line, for anybody who doesn't know what Teen Line is, it's a wonderful organization, but they did some research and they found out that how you respond to somebody who's reaching out for help determines not only their relationship with that person, but their likelihood to reach out for help for the rest of their lives. So we do have to change the person that's receiving it.
Yeah. And that actually saved my life. It's for 25 cents. I bought Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, at 12. That was my first through line to, wait a minute, I can survive. And then at 14 and a half, I started volunteering at a suicide hotline, where I, for the first time, got to learn that other people also are in the depths of pain. And I'm not alone. And I can show up and have a conversation with somebody that might save their life, but that actually foundationally saved my life. But that shouldn't be encapsulated only in hotlines. That's the power and the opportunity now. That's why we're all here tonight.
Do you have tips for anybody that maybe their loved one reaches out to them and they're not quite feeling prepared? That's what I hear a lot. What tips can you give that's practical advice?
And you have to put your hand up, but anybody ever experienced that? It's scary. Yeah. And when we're in a state of anxiety, and when somebody we love is reaching out and in a state of pain, our brain is designed to want to step in and make change or fix. Because our system says, if I do something, I will feel better. And what foundationally happens in those moments is we miss the person who's in pain. And my mom was gracious enough to let me share a story about that in the book. Thank you, Mom. In those moments, it's an invitation to notice what is happening inside of us, and then to invite that to step back and give ourselves permission to just be. Our only job when somebody is reaching out is to be present. Now, in Western America, we're pretty bad at that. in American Western society in general. We're really bad at saying, I can just be. In a moment of crisis, that is our number one job for anybody. I see you, I hear you, I'm with you, and I'm going to partner with you in your pain. That is all. Because if we try to fix, anybody ever had somebody try to tell you what to do when you didn't ask for it? Who here is parents and or is married and or has a boss? Yeah, and what happens? We don't want it. It's alienating. It separates us even further. So our job is to just, and it's harder than it sounds, but that is the thing that will save a life.
Being authentic is helpful too, because it's okay to be authentic and say, I don't know, but we'll figure this out together.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I'm so glad you said that, because there's something weird that happens in grief where somebody shares something they've been through. And then the next step is, oh, I'm going to tell you about my version of that story. And that's also not good, because we're turning the spotlight back to us when the person really needs us to be there with them. It's like, oh, my empathy is telling me I need to share with you my story. And I invite all of us to push pause on that, because when we step in with our story, we're turning the spotlight off of the person who really just needs us to be with them in that moment. Our story may be helpful later, but in that moment, let's lean in and get curious and be loving and kind and show up and just say, I'm with you. I don't know how to respond to this. That's actually a really beautiful response. The people who said that to me after the loss of my fiance, I was like, thank you. Because I don't know how to be in it either. And that was actual empathy.
Now, for the person that is dealing with trauma, you talked about neuroplasticity. Is there any tips you can give them or any advice for things they can do at home from maybe a public health standpoint to help them start to rewire their brain?
Oh, boy. Well, I did write a book on that. Dr. Kristen Neff is one of the world's foremost experts on self-compassion. And her website is just filled with information and tools and exercises about how we can start to partner with ourselves through a lens of self-compassion. Self-compassion is one of the most powerful tools that we have to change a trauma story. So how many people here are compassionate? Yeah, we are innately biologically wired to have compassion for other people. We are only self-compassionate if we have been taught to be that way. And self-compassion is like the gateway drug to self-healing. Because if we can turn inward and say, I am deserving of even 5 seconds of self-care, of mindful presence, of breath work, of something that I deeply love, self-healing, havening, any of those things, then the world is our oyster. It starts with taking the chance to say I'm deserving. And that's what self-compassion is in so many ways about. I will jump in and care for you if any of you are in pain. And my team members have seen me literally run into a building that we thought was on fire to save people. But I would never run into a building on fire for me until more recently. That was me learning how to know that I mattered. And so often we're not taught that we matter. Not intentionally. It just gets forgotten. So that's the gateway drug, self-compassion.
Okay. So how did you learn self-compassion?
Oh, I decided I wasn't going to die.
That was the first step.
That was the first step. No, that sounds dark and heavy. Meaning making. Meaning making and purpose are two, and the science shows this, two of the most important protective variables against depression, against trauma, that can guide us through the darkness into the light. And when I didn't believe that I was deserving, when I was struggling to keep breathing, hence the title of the book, the one thing that I kept holding on to was there had to be a reason why I was still around. There had to be a bigger purpose. And we've talked about spirituality and all of that. And I'm a spiritualist, and I'm also a person who's deeply pragmatic and a scientist. But I believe that there was a reason why I wasn't dead yet. And that sometimes is the foundation. And so when we're in the deepest, darkest parts of despair, the not being dead yet part may be, maybe I'm not dead yet. And I had these moments because I have 2 dogs that I love. And if I'm not here, who's going to take care of my dogs? I'm not about to surrender them to a shelter. And I did have those thoughts. I'm not kidding. I don't know if I don't think my parents have heard this yet. Sometimes that's the meaning making, is there's something depending on me. Sometimes the meaning making is, for whatever has happened, for whatever impact people have had on my life, I can go on and do something different or create purpose from it. And then it's finding the tiny anchors. So we chatted a little bit yesterday. So the cover of the book is the first painting that I was able to do after John died. He was one of the very first people to believe in my capacity in so many ways that I really felt seen and heard within. And one of them was he really encouraged me to paint. And after he died, I could not paint. And then one day, I had a little bit of wine, sure. And I just busted out my paints, and it was like a rebellious act of, I'm going to do this. And I made this painting, and I called it Possibilities. And I hung it on my wall. And every day when I woke up, I would look at that painting and say, there's some reason. And then if anybody here's ever published a book, the journey for a cover is awful. Like, you create this entire amazing story, and then to create a cover is like so awful. And so eventually I reached out to my mom, who's an amazing artist. I said, Mom, can you paint me something? And she just kept looking at me, and she's like, sure. She's working on the painting. And she kept looking at me. She's like, you have the painting. I'm happy to do this, but you have the painting on your wall. That is the painting. I will do this for you, but that is the painting. And it's that crystallizing of seeing the bigger picture. That when we're in the darkness, it's hard, right? And so the painting for me was an anchor. And I think that's one of the biggest things, is how do we find those tiny anchors, the symbolic representations of something material that we run into. And that painting was something that kept me alive, because it reminded me of him. It was very long-winded.
No, that's okay. It's a beautiful painting, very calming. You had disclosed to me that, and I believe it's in your book as well, that after John died, that you had this internal struggle because you had done so much work and you thought you were healed, and now you're being thrown back into this. Do you mind just expanding on that story and really explaining what that was like for you?
Yeah. So how many of us feel like we sometimes know things? Yeah. And what's it like when we realize that what we think we know is just kind of ripped away in any area of our life? It's terrifying and it's scary. And it also requests a really deep humility. And so I thought I knew so much. And going back to the story I shared at the beginning of this conversation of once again being spun into an acute stress disorder after the patient came into our offices to try to harm me, there was this reckoning for me of realizing that I had, get this, 5 degrees. I was very adept at bidding for my worth and trying to give myself meaning and value through my ability to perform in an educational space. Now, I say that 5 degrees in a little bit of a derisive way. And I say that because, that's a lot of privilege. I'm very grateful. Thank you, guys. I did 3 at the same time. I'm also, which gives you context for who I am. But those degrees gave me a sense of security within who I was that wasn't real. And they also allowed me to be highly dissociated from myself as an actual human. And when John died, I had to have a reckoning with the fact that, yeah, I knew a lot. But guess what? I knew nothing about what actually mattered. I didn't know how to live. I didn't know how to have relationships. I had so lost myself in one relationship then that I literally had no context of myself as a self. And so sometimes what we do can feel like such a safe space, but the hardest thing is to figure out how to be. And that was the reckoning, and that took a long time. And it's an everyday journey.
Traumatic grief is a profound and unique type of mourning. You've experienced that. How has that shaped how you give treatment to your clients?
Partnership. Nobody here has not lost something or someone, or even parts of themselves. For those of us who are survivors of complicated things in our childhood, we're even still grieving the what should have been but wasn't. Moving into the world of traumatic grief taught me to recognize and partner with the fact that grief is an everyday journey of our lives, and to really connect with the fact that that matters, and that our society is so devoid of grieving processes and having those conversations.
Everything you've been through, PTSD, grief, complicated grief, usually it leads to experiences and lessons that you weren't expecting. Is there anything you can share with us on the lessons that you learned in your journey?
Yeah, the biggest one being that my diehard experiences of having the superpower of dissociation, not good. They can only work in very specific contexts, but that superpower is not great when it comes to building villages and community. I think the number one lesson is something I endeavor to embody every day, is that when my brain and my body say disconnect, run away, I need to lean in. That drive to disconnect, that drive to run away, that drive to shut down, that drive to isolate, those are old patterns. And when that information shows up, it usually means that it's time for me to reach out, and to also remember that I have the safety and the village and the ability to do so. And that is awesome. Thank you for being a part of my village.
This book, from the work that I do in the ground, this book will save lives. And for that, I thank you and your vulnerability.
Thank you all for being here.